Without even bothering to declare war, the German armies launched a coordinated attack across the neutral borders of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland, from the Maginot Line north to the sea. The action along the entire front was simultaneous, so for purposes of clarity, let's take up one country at a time. First, let's see what happened in Holland. Nazi ground forces smashed through the improvised and hastily erected border defenses. But the main attack was to come from the air, far behind the defense lines. Over 10,000 troops were landed in this manner. Before the stunned citizens of Rotterdam even knew they were at war, these troops, aided by well-trained fifth columnists, quickly captured the airport and outlying sections of the city. Meantime, Nazi armored columns were racing across the country, their progress speeded by other fifth columnists who prevented the destruction of vital dikes and bridges. These forces effected a meeting with the parachutists landed in Rotterdam. The Dutch were doomed to defeat. On the fourth day of the invasion, the Nazis gave the Dutch general an ultimatum. All Dutch resistance must cease, or Rotterdam will be bombed flat. The Dutch general had little choice. To save the lives of innocent civilians, he accepted the German terms. But after the unconditional surrender, the Nazis bombed the city anyway. Flights of unopposed German bombers flew low over the center of Rotterdam and methodically bombed it into a heap of rubble. one of the most ruthless exhibitions of savagery the world has ever seen. Over 30,000 men, women, and children were killed in the space of 90 minutes. Though only 6 months before, Hitler had said, "The new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland. The Dutch will not forget." Meantime, in Belgium, the whole force of Nazi blitzkrieg had stormed across its neutral borders. The main German attack was directed at the Albert Canal-Meuse River line, the anchor of which was Fort Ibn Amail, a modern and seemingly impregnable fortress. The Germans had secretly built a replica of the mighty fortress in Czechoslovakia and had rehearsed the attack until they knew every detail of the fort's construction and its every weakness. When the real attack came, it was foolproof. Parachute troops, dive bombers, flamethrowers, specially trained engineer battalions, all working together as a well-trained team. They knew exactly where to cross the river. Notice that this assault engineer knows exactly where to put his high explosive charge in order to destroy the blockhouse. Fort Ibn Amail withstood the Nazi attack exactly 2 days. And the German armies rolled on. Meantime, an hour and a half after the German invasion began, Allied troops crossed the French and Belgian border to meet the advancing Germans. As they raced across Belgium to take up their defense positions, they met an obstacle they hadn't counted on. Refugees. And the refugee-choked roads didn't get that way by accident. The Nazis methodically bombed little towns and villages, otherwise devoid of any military value, not so much to kill as to drive the inhabitants out onto the highway. Then, by expert machine gunning, the Nazis would herd them along in terror-stricken flight to hopelessly entangle the advancing Allied armies. Refugees used as a weapon of war, a new low in inhumanity. No school today, the sign says. But children are otherwise occupied. No, no school today. Although only 6 months before, Hitler had announced, "The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium." The Belgians will not forget. And what about the Allies? They were convinced that the German attack on Belgium and Holland was the main thrust, and according to plan, had swung their armies like a gate into Belgium. But the attack on Belgium and Holland was only a feint. The main German attack was to be centered where the Allies least expected it, through the Ardennes forest. For this decisive blow, they had secretly assembled the mightiest striking force the world had ever seen, including 45,000 armored vehicles.
At the same time that the Nazi armies were plunging into Holland and Belgium, this column started to move. Well-trained engineer battalions went first. They were opposed only by scattered Allied patrols. They cleared pathways for the tanks to follow. In 3 days, the Germans' armored force reached the Meuse River, 2 days faster than the French thought any troops could get through. By all rules, the Germans should have paused here to bring up heavy artillery before attempting to force the river. But the Nazis had a new type of artillery, dive bombers. With them, they blasted the French positions across the Meuse. With feverish haste, the Germans laid a barrage across the river with anything and everything that would shoot.
Tremendous concentration of firepower continued all through the night. By the following day, shock troops were able to get across the river. These shock troops held the bridgehead until the engineers brought up pontons and built bridges. Then, without wasting a moment, across these bridges, the main armored force of the German military machine rolled through to Sedan for the all-important breakthrough into a dismayed and flat-footed France. There went the old ball game for the Allies. From here on, it was only a matter of how long. Watch the map as one of our intelligence officers explains the details of the German breakthrough.
We speak of the breakthrough at Sedan, but actually the break was along a wide front extending for 50 miles from Namur in Belgium to Sedan. Further north, the Allied armies had swung like a gate into these positions. The German armies had swept over Holland, broken the line of the Albert Canal, and for all anyone knew, were preparing to smash against the Allied front with all their power. That was the situation, dangerous but obscure, on the evening of May 13th. On the 14th and 15th, it became clear that the German breakthrough south of Namur was in the greatest strength, and that the French Ninth Army, attacked while moving into position, had been shattered. Without doubt, this was the point of mortal danger, and the French High Command ordered the abandonment of these positions, although they had not yet been attacked. Those positions were abandoned solely because of the situation developing along the Meuse near Sedan. In the meantime, the French 7th Army had been ordered to make its historic forced march far to the south into the area threatened by the rapidly advancing German spearheads. This army was not used to attack the German flank, but rather was used as a plug to restore the broken front. Throughout, the Allies had placed their faith not in offense, but in defense, and the defense was doomed to failure because it was confronted with an entirely new technique in warfare, the plane tank infantry team in action. The world was staggered by the speed with which the German armored columns moved. What was the secret that enabled armies to move so far so rapidly? The secret lay in the organization of the striking spearhead. Armored forces came first, closely followed by motorized divisions, which peeled off, forming solid walls. And through the corridor thus formed raced the supply trucks to feed the ever-lengthening column. It was obvious that if the Allied situation was to be restored, the German column would have to be cut. On May 17th, General de Gaulle attacked the German flank and captured a few prisoners. But his light mechanized forces were like a pin pricking the side of a rhinoceros. A subsequent attack met with even less success. The means for a really successful counterattack against the German corridor simply did not exist. Where numbers of divisions were required, only handfuls of companies and battalions were available. A valiant attempt to cut the German corridor was made by a group of slow-moving British tanks just south of Arras. But lack of sustained striking power doomed this valiant unit to destruction. On May 21st, the German spearhead reached the channel port of Abbeville. Protecting their flank along the Somme, the Germans fanned out to the north and east. This was to be the perfect battle of annihilation. On May 28th, the Belgian army, compressed into a small space and weary of battle, laid down its arms. That left the desperate French and British defenders with their backs to the sea at the small channel port of Dunkirk.
One of the greatest disasters in history seemed in the making. An entire British army faced annihilation. But out of the fog and the mist shrouding the channel came a strange armada of Navy craft, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, anything that would float. The seagoing people of Britain had come to rescue their army. High overhead, British fighter planes fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill. Below, small Allied suicide units held the Germans back long enough for the miracle of Dunkirk to take place. $211,500 British troops, plus 112,500 French and Belgian were rescued. Over 300,000 battle-tested men, grimly determined to go back again with new tools, new weapons with which to blast the hated Nazis out of this world. For free men are like rubber balls. The harder they fall, the higher they bounce. Leading the British by this time was a man who had been bouncing all his life, Winston Churchill, who had tried for years to warn the world about Germany. Meantime, the situation that faced France was as nearly hopeless as a military situation can be. 2/5 of the French army was lost. There were fewer than 50 divisions left to defend a front almost 200 miles long, running from the northern end of the Maginot Line to the sea. And behind that thin front line, there were no reserves. The despairing people of Paris sent their children south, praying that some miracle would keep them from harm. The hopeless men of the French army, without adequate arms or equipment, braced themselves for the coming blow.
The first blow fell on June 5th. The French resistance was determined, but by June 8th, the left flank army had been shattered and a general withdrawal was ordered to the line of the Marne and the Seine. On June 9th, the German main attack came. Within 2 days, the German armored and motorized divisions roared out into the open terrain. With this breakthrough, the issue of the Battle of France was decided, and from that time on, there was official talk of an armistice. Now, what about the famous Maginot Line? Let's go back and take a look. On June 14th, the Germans launched 2 attacks against the Maginot Line. In both cases, penetrations were effected. But we must remember that this was against fortifications defended by men devoid of hope.
In the meantime, Mussolini, now thinking it's safe, sent his division racing across the border.
The hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
Organized resistance in France was no longer possible. The government faced 2 alternatives: retire to North Africa and carry on from there, or give up the struggle. France's leaders were old and tired, and the oldest and most tired was Marshal Pétain. Egged on by men like Laval, who saw in a German victory his chance for personal power, on June 16th, Pétain asked for an armistice. The news is carried to Hitler, who received this word of a great nation's fall in a characteristic manner. Also characteristic were his terms for the armistice. It must be signed in the coach where Marshal Foch met the defeated Germans in the last war. The French delegation arrived to pay the final price of French disunity and the treachery of some of its leaders. The final price, a price that for centuries to come, the French won't forget. More than 3/5 of their country was to be blacked out by a military occupation. The remainder was to be controlled by a French government acceptable to Hitler. A tax of 400 million francs a day was to be imposed on the French people to support the German army of occupation. Nearly 2 million French prisoners of war were to be taken into Germany and kept there as hostages, to work as slaves or rot of hunger, tuberculosis, or other diseases in concentration camps. Men deliberately and permanently separated from their families in order to decrease the French birth rate and thus eliminate France as a world power in future generations. French civilians, men, women, and children, must slave on farm or in factory for the Nazi master race or starve. There will be a class of subject alien races. We need not hesitate to call them slaves. French children were to grow up on such inadequate food that many would reach the age of 12 before they grew new teeth. And for any attempts to protest against these restrictions, thousands of innocent French civilians would be executed. This was the price the French were to pay as they signed the armistice. And a master of the master race must go to Paris to tour the streets of what was once the City of Light. You notice no cheering crowds here to welcome in the new order. When the people of Paris come to the streets again, it is to hear the voice of dictators telling them what they must do, how they must live, what they must say, what they must think, telling them how to be slaves. Gone is the Republic of France. Gone is free speech and a free representative government. Gone is liberty, equality, fraternity. These are the French. With their ears, they listen. But their minds and their hearts, these are down on the Mediterranean where the battle colors of the regiments are being taken to Africa, out of the Nazi grasp. The people weep as their glory departs, for they don't as yet know that France has hope, a rallying point. Charles de Gaulle, a soldier in the great tradition of Foch, is not surrendering. He will continue to fight, gathering about him loyal Frenchmen from all over the world to become the Free French Army, the fighting French. Yes, the people weep as they watch their colors go, not knowing that 2 years later, those same flags would again be unfurled in North Africa, alongside the Stars and Stripes, alongside the Union Jack. Once more, their leaders, General de Gaulle and the famous General Giraud, stand united in the common cause with the leaders of their allies. Once more, the red, white, and blue of France is raised on high. For out of the ashes of the defeat and the humiliation of France, her soul has been born again.